are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon. My name is Kim Ponzio, and I'd like to welcome you all to the Society of Wetland Scientists December webinar. Because this is our first free webinar for members and non-members alike, I'd like to give you just a quick overview of what SWS is all about. Our mission as the Society of Wetland Scientists is to promote understanding, conservation, protection, restoration, science-based management, and sustainability of wetlands. Next slide. SWS was founded in 1980, and we now have over 3,000 members from 62 countries. We have a diverse membership hailing from all sectors of wetland science and practice, including a large sector of students. There are very valuable benefits of becoming an SWS member. Every year you receive 6 issues of our journal, Wetlands, and 4 issues of Wetland Science and Practice, monthly newsletters, access to a dynamic website, and job posting and training opportunities. Next. You also have access to these monthly members-only SWS webinars, regional chapter activities, the annual conference with discounted rates, and opportunities to serve in leadership. We also have 7 special interest sections that you can join, and if you're a student, we have several student associations in the U.S., and we're hoping to develop more in other countries. In addition, we also have a number of incredibly successful programs for students for travel and research grants, and our newest Wetland Ambassadors Exchange program. And you can go to our website, www.sws.org, to learn more about the membership dues, but make sure you don't wait and you join or you renew your membership today, and your membership is going to be good until December 31st, 2017. So before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping announcements. Just to familiarize you with the GoToMeeting screens, there's an attendee control panel where you can control the audio for the webinar by using your telephone or microphone and speakers. The general format of our webinar today will be a 40 to 45-minute presentation by our speaker, followed by approximately 15 minutes of questions from the participants. However, at any time during the presentation, you can type your questions into the questions pane, and as the moderator at the end of the presentation, I will pose the questions to our presenter. This webinar is being recorded, and you'll receive a link to the recording following the webinar. We also ask that you take a moment to complete the evaluation survey that will pop up at the end of the webinar, and that'll help us to plan future events. So if you'd like a hard copy of today's slides, there is a PDF copy in the handout section on the GoTo screen, and you can download that. And if you want to tweet, you can use hashtag SWS webinar. So we're going to test the questions pane, and at the same time we're going to get a little demographic information. If you could please put in where you are from, your state or your country, and how many people are attending the webinar with you. Right now I see already that we have someone from the UK, Arkansas, Washington, Virginia, and most people are attending. I see some people attending by themselves. Some people have up to 4 or 5 people with them. So thank you for doing that. We'll be able to look at that and kind of get some demographic information. So with the logistics out of the way, I would like to get started with our webinar. So I'll be introducing our speaker today is Ramesh Reddy, who's a graduate research professor of biogeochemistry and the chairman of the Soil and Water Sciences Department at the University of Florida. He conducts research in the areas of coupled biogeochemical cycling of nutrients as related to surface water quality, restoration of wetlands and aquatic systems, ecological indicators, carbon sequestration, and greenhouse gas emissions. Reddy has served on numerous advisory committees at state, national, and international levels to assist agencies to develop science-based policy. Reddy has chaired 60 doctoral and master's thesis committees and has served on an additional 130 graduate student committees. Publications related to Dr. Reddy's research can be viewed at soils.ifas.ufl.edu/wetlands, and I'm sure you'll see that web address later on in the presentation. Dr. Reddy's select awards and honors include the Soil Science Applied Research Award from the Soil Science Society of America in 2001, the Environmental Quality Research Award from the American Society of Agronomy in 2002, an award of Fellow from the American Association for the Advancement of Science also in 2002, and he was named Fellow by both the Soil Science Society of America and the American Society of Agronomy in 1988, and he was awarded the Lifetime Achievement Award by the International Association for Ecology Wetlands Working Group in 2012. And he won 2 prestigious awards just this year, the National Wetlands Award for Research from the Environmental Law Institute, and most importantly, he won the 2016 Lifetime Achievement Award from the Society of Wetland Scientists. And today he will deliver our second SWS Legacy webinar. And finally, I'd like to add a personal note that Dr. Reddy's enthusiasm for wetlands and his kind and nurturing spirit was something that helped many students, including myself, to develop our love for studying wetlands and transform it into a rewarding career in wetland science. So welcome, Ramesh, and I'll turn things over to you.
Oops. Let's see, did we? Thank you, Kim, for a very kind introduction. Next few minutes, what I'm going to do is tell my life story in one way, the transformation of soil scientist. I was an agronomist at the start of my career into a wetland scientist. I would like to address 3 concepts here, the relevance of wetlands related to food security and climate change and water quality. So when we talk about in the title I said mud, the life in the mud. So when we talk about the mud, I was looking for the definition of mud. So it's a water-soaked soil, a soft, wet earth, or a sticky material which has a lot of clay, probably some organic matter, always saturated with water, and it can be soils and sediments underwater, like sediments could be like lakes or streams. So it has different definitions depending on where this mud is found. So if you think about the mud, for some people mud may be a different thing. So here's people enjoying the mud, and there's some the trucks going in the mud. So all kinds of things happen in the mud, but I'm not going to talk about this. Also the mudslides. You've seen mudslides especially in California and other locations. And also the mud houses is very common in Africa, India, and other parts of the Asian subcontinent. And also, tragically, sometimes food shortage is also forcing children to eat mud. They got mud cakes. So this is some thing going on in Haiti. So it happens in a lot of parts of the African subcontinent. So this is one of the reasons the mud is used as a nutrient source is because it has a lot of basic nutrients which we normally take it for granted. So what I'm going to talk about is the people who are really in this particular slide, their efforts as a scientists, the students, or the managers working in different ecosystems. So, and you can see here in this particular slide, Dr. Ronnie Best. He was the Society of Wetland Scientists, the president back in the early 80s. And here's Mark Clark, our extension specialist, and he is exposed his daughter, who was only about 3 or 4 years old, to wetland environments. So I'm going to talk about some of the experiences I had with these wonderful students and colleagues over the years. So when we talk about the wetland setting and aquatic systems, we think about a lot of ecosystems, right? One is the wetlands. They could be natural or constructed wetlands. And also the aquatic system could be streams and rivers, and the reservoirs, stormwater detention ponds, lakes, estuaries. All of them are interconnected in a watershed system. So they're all connected to each other in one way or other with water. Also, I added one more wetland, which usually known as a paddy fields or rice. That's where my life started as an agronomist who was originally interested in food production, mainly rice production. So now we actually call them as a managed wetlands or similar to constructed wetland systems. So common feature of all this ecosystem I showed you before is the mud. So the reason I use the word mud is I didn't want to use soils or the sediments. A combination of that is a mud, which I think was kind of describes the basic features of this ecosystem. So if you're thinking about soils, you can talk about the paddy soils, the waterlogged soils. Some areas of the landscape is actually flooded during heavy rainy seasons, maybe. Or poorly drained soil with heavy clays, or the peat soils that are poorly drained, and all the hydric soils. So, and wetland systems which also have soils which is poorly drained or a whole lot of water. When you talk about the lakes, maybe we talk about streams, sediment, rivers. You talk about sediments and mud flats, estuaries. So one combination we talk about the sediment. One systems we talk about soils. But the common feature in all of them is the oxygen deficiency in these soils, and that creates anaerobic conditions, and those conditions really make it difficult for many biotic organisms to survive. But there are some organisms which can survive in this harsh environment. So when you're talking about wetlands, wetlands are distributed all over the world. And many of them are drained because of urban developments. And if you look at the more specifically, let's see, in the United States, we lost more than 50% of wetlands. In Florida, we lost about 50%, and in Louisiana, we lost about 50%. But these are some of the remaining wetlands that we're trying to protect. And because now we realize for the last 3 or 4 decades, we've been working really hard to protect some of these wetlands because of their valuable functions. Although wetlands occupy globally only 6% of the land surface, they provide ecosystem service much larger than the area itself. So here's several freshwater wetland systems. This is not new for many of you, and again, it's salt marsh ecosystems here. What you're seeing is a couple of slides here. This is a Barataria Bay, which was impacted by the oil spills recently, and you can see some of the oil is still present in the in the sediment cores. I will talk about that briefly in the later part of this presentation. Agriculture. The mud is very common in agriculture, especially the rice ecosystems, and I'll talk about this one. Most of these pictures are taken in Asian subcontinent, where the rice is a staple food. And this particular slide has a very personal attachment to you. That's my family farm, where I actually walked through this as a kid into this rice paddies just for play, as a playground. So the soil cores, you see here, all of them, you see here, are pretty much deficient in oxygen. And then the plants which grow also are deficient in oxygen. I'll touch base in a couple of minutes. What you see, the reddish brown color you see around the root zone is the oxidation of iron oxides in the root zone. The main reason for that oxidation is these plants which grow in this wetland system can pump oxygen into the root zone, and that's how they survive. So typically, when we look at the wetland systems, historically, the wetland systems, we know the input and output and relations between them very well. So we've been spending a lot of resources, a lot of time over the years, at least last 40, 50 years or so. We understand the hydrology and we understand the hydraulic loading rates very well. But the internal processes within the mud itself in the soil profile are not as well known. Although we made strides for the last couple of decades or so to understand these internal processes. One of the reasons I think is the often regulators or the managers considered these processes are very complex, and also often it's viewed as mysterious because we don't see those processes. Just like we see vegetation, water outside, we can view them, but we cannot see these biogeochemical processes happening in the system. And also is often considered not important by managers and policymakers because they feel that they may not really impact the outflow of a given system or the other functions of the wetland system. But that has been changed. That was the original thinking. Now there's a lot more appreciation of these internal processes. So what I want to focus the remaining presentation is these 3-4 macro elements. I'm going to talk about a little bit of carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus as 3 macro elements which actually control many ecosystem processes, and sulfur is also very important, especially when you consider in the coastal wetland systems. So what's the main element which controls everything is the carbon. Carbon is the hub of the biogeochemistry, all the internal processes, and nitrogen is linked to carbon, sulfur is linked to carbon, phosphorus is linked to carbon. So all of them are controlled by the abiotic and biotic processes happening in the system. And these macro elements are present both in non-mobile forms, meaning that they are actually in the soil, organic matter, or soil minerals, or whatever we may have in the system. But also there's a mobile portion of the same elements, and that mobile portion is really controls the fluxes from soil to overlying water column, thereby regulating the water quality issues, regulating the other environmental issues related to wetlands. So the biotic communities which survive in this harsh environment, the lack of oxygen, the several plant communities have adapted to those conditions, and also several benthic invertebrates can also survive in the mud, and then algal communities are very productive in the water column, and of course the microbial communities which are play a central role in regulating the overall productivity of the ecosystem functions. So oxygen typically enters through the atmosphere and then through the water column. As soon as oxygen diffuses into the water column, the diffusive flux of that oxygen is reduced by about 10,000 times and goes through the soil itself, and then thereby creating a sharp aerobic zone. Under that is the anaerobic zone. So if the water table goes down, this oxygen can penetrate between the soil particles and then reach the anaerobic zone. So you have the big aerobic zone here, and then whereas it's completely flooded, aerobic zone is restricted to surface layers. When you have plants, and the plants in a drained system are in a wetland system which is drained, oxygen can easily move through the soil profile, so the root respiration is supported by oxygen without much problem, and plants survive really well. Whereas in the flooded conditions, when the wetlands are flooded, oxygen tend to go through the plant itself. There's a parenchyma or arenchyma tissue within the plant itself that can provide the path for oxygen to freely move in the air spaces, and then oxygen leaks out of the root zone and thereby oxidize some of the reduced compounds which are present in the root zone, and then keep that plant alive, and thereby creating a thin aerobic layer around the root zone that will support the microbial communities which are important to transforming those microelements I was talking about. And I will talk about a little more in detail the role of this oxygen and other electron acceptors in regulating these cycles. So now the benthic invertebrates, they can also channelize in the mud itself and then pump oxygen into the root zone, into the sediments itself, and then thereby cycling nutrients and increasing fluxes from the soil to overlying water column. So the microbes is a very, very important, play an important role because they are the key for transforming all those cycles and the fluxes from the mobile pools to non-mobile and non-mobile to mobile pools of the macro elements, especially carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. So the way you want to envision the biogeochemistry of these processes, so think about the computer we are to take it for granted nowadays. It has a hard drive. Now we can have 1 trillion gigabytes of a hard drive, and you can store a lot of materials, but that computer is really not useful if there's no operating system which is really turning the system on. So that operating system, typically now we take it for granted, is like Windows 7, maybe now Windows 10 or 13, whatever we may have, if it's a Microsoft. This is not advertisement for Microsoft, but I think it's, I'm just using the basic computer to analyze a situation here. So with that operating system, with the storage in the hard drive, now you are able to get some functions. The functions could be the Microsoft Word, which is a function it delivers, and also Excel spreadsheets. Now we should take it for granted, that another function, and the PowerPoint we're just using right now, so that could be another function. So view this one in the context of the wetland itself. So think about the mud. The soil is your hard drive. The soil actually stores a lot of these elements, it's a sink. So it can store enormous amount of the carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and also it's a home for the microbes. You know, it is 1 teaspoon of the soil would have more than 1 billion microbes. So they do important transformations. But what's the operating system? Just being microbes and the storage of the material is not enough. Operating system is the biogeochemistry, the biogeochemical processes which activate these microbes to do things, transform non-mobile carbon, non-mobile nitrogen into more mobile nitrogen, which plants can use it, microbes can use it, and also the flux those soluble forms into overlying water column. So because of those processes happening in the soil that can deliver the production, plant productivity is directly linked to what happens in the soil. Greenhouse gas emissions we're talking about is also directly linked to what happens in the soil. And of course the carbon sequestration and as well as the water quality is also affected by these biogeochemical processes. So now, so I can go into more complex. I'm not going to spend time here. Look at the carbon cycle. You got the main end products of carbon cycles are the greenhouse gases, the methane, the carbon dioxide. But these two gases, wetlands function as a source, and also the export of the dissolved organic matter. The dissolved organic matter which is exported from the wetlands serves as the energy source for the organisms in the adjacent aquatic systems. And coupled to that is the nitrogen cycle. The nitrogen and carbon are tightly coupled, so whatever happens to the carbon and also happens to the nitrogen cycle. So important things we need to think about here is the greenhouse gases, which is nitrous oxide, and also the soluble forms of the nitrogen discharge from the wetland systems, and also under certain cases you could have the ammonia volatilization, which is a gas which can come out of that one. But nitrogen is a primary plant nutrient, which actually enhances the productivities. It's a major plant nutrient. And I'm not showing the other cycles like phosphorus and sulfur cycles, so those are also equally important. And all these elements are coupled to carbon. So whatever happens to the carbon also happens to the both nitrogen, phosphorus, and as well as sulfur. So now, let me just show a couple of slides of how these organisms actually function. So think about our battery we use, which has the anode and cathode. So anode is the electron donor and cathode is the electron acceptor. So organic matter, as it decomposes in the system, it can be converted into simple compounds such as glucose. So as the glucose gets oxidized, it produces carbon dioxide and also produces electrons, and that's what our body does also. And that happens in the human body as well as in animal bodies or any other living organisms. So electrons need to be accepted somewhere, so that those electrons are shunted to the another part where the oxygen is present in the system. So oxygen takes electrons and reduces them to water. So this oxidation reduction reactions is the one keeps us going and then keeps us alive, not only just human bodies, but any biotic organisms. And as a result, we produce energy. About a number of ATPs are produced. So this is basically how the battery operates to generate the energy, and then we're talking about energies generated in the biological systems. So, but in wetlands are unique. So wetlands are unique. You don't have enough oxygen to for organisms to survive. So they have to depend on other elements. So this is the same organisms which are respiring with oxygen. Once the oxygen is curtailed as a result of flooding or other management strategies in the wetland systems, those same organisms are switched to facultative role, meaning that they can use the other electron acceptors in their respiration. So in this case also, organic matter is oxidized into carbon dioxide. Now electrons are produced. So those electrons are now shunted into the nitrate. The nitrate which is present in the system can accept those electrons and then convert that nitrate to nitrous oxide and then ultimately nitrogen gas. And then energy is also produced. And this process we call denitrification. Is a very, very important function of the nitrogen cycle, where the wetlands function as a sink for nitrate. And also at the same time, it's accepting those nitrate as electron acceptor, and also that process, denitrification, supports the organic matter breakdown and thereby releasing nutrients, just like in the aerobic decomposition, which I showed you in the previous slide. Oops. Just what happened again, I think here. Okay. So another function, I think, which is also very important, if you go to extreme reduced conditions, organic matter goes through the same oxidation process, and you got a fermentation going on under extremely anaerobic conditions, and the hydrogen is produced as a result of that one, and the electrons are released. Those electrons now accepted by the carbon dioxide, which is abundant in wetland systems, now converted to methane. So that's the important function. May not be a useful function, but it supports the microorganisms which are producing methane, and the methane is a very, very important greenhouse gas. So all these processes are coupled with the physical, chemical, and biological processes, and the transforming these elements from the non-mobile forms into mobile forms. Ultimately, they would have an influence on the food security in one way, and also in the climate change and the water quality. So I'm going to touch base these three topical areas in the next few slides. And so the summary of some of the work, I think, is published in the book shown here. Food security. The reason I put the food security here, I think, is as you know, the global population is increasing. By 2050, we need to feed about 9.5 billion people. For that one, I think, is most of the population is in two continents, right? One is in the Asian subcontinent and as well as in African continent. That's where most of the population resides. And then the rice is the staple food for more than 50% of the world population. And also that's almost 3 billion people are now. By 2050, that could be 6 billion people maybe. And in Asia, it's up almost 100% of the people actually eat rice. And like I mentioned before, the rice ecosystems are similar to wetland ecosystems, so that's the reason I selected this rice ecosystem as a part of the life in the mud talk. So rice production is distributed throughout the world, but I'll come back to mostly the United States. The rice is grown in Arkansas, Texas, Louisiana, and California, and also there's some rice grown in South Florida. About maybe 20,000 acres of rice is grown in South Florida on those Everglades agricultural peatlands. And the 90% of the production of the rice is in Asia, because that's where I think the most people consume rice. So one of the things happened, I think, back in near World War II in 1913, a Haber-based process. The process actually helped to produce fertilizers, mainly the ammonium. So under high pressure and temperatures, the nitrogen is reacted with hydrogen and then produce ammonia as a fertilizer. So that really helped to solve the global food problem. And Haber, this is Haber here, who won the Nobel Prize for that one. But their intent was actually not the food security at that time. They were actually using that nitrogen for the weapons, but ultimately that spilled over to develop the fertilizer. And also, as we know, the nitrogen is a pollutant. I think, especially nitrogen applied to the upland systems can be transported to the groundwaters and as well as the surface waters. And then there's the major effort is going on in Asian subcontinent is to how to improve the efficiency of nitrogen used by rice. And this is what I started when I first came to the United States in 1970. That my interest at that time was actually to improve the nitrogen efficiency to produce more rice in Louisiana. That's what the research project was. And I was not even thinking about wetlands. I have not even walked through any wetlands at that time. So that really helped me to develop this particular study, which I was very proud of, is to track the nitrogen fertilizer in a rice paddy system. This study was done back in 1970, where I applied the 100 kilograms of nitrogen using stable isotope tracer N15, and then I tracked that nitrogen for 4 or 5 years and where the nitrogen is going. And we lost a lot of nitrogen, up to 37% through volatilization losses. Denitrification is about 8 to 14%, and then how much nitrogen gain. So we could get a handle on the mass balance of nitrogen, and up to 20% of the nitrogen we added actually stayed in the soil itself. We got immobilized into organic matter, and that nitrogen actually provided some source to the subsequent crops, not as much as this crop is needed, but the residual nitrogen could be tracked for several years. So using this kind of information, we can actually determine the efficiency of the nitrogen by the rice plants, so that we can develop the management strategies. Now, I think the several practices are used how to apply nitrogen. So they're trying to apply the nitrogen in the root zone so that they can increase the efficiency. And then there's a lot of efforts are going on. In addition to the use of nitrogen used by this rice plant, and also increase in rice production also resulted in producing nitrous oxide. So now there's a major effort is going on how to decrease the nitrous oxide emissions in rice paddies. And another greenhouse gas, which is also becoming very common, is the methane emissions from the rice paddies, which has actually become, these two greenhouse gases are becoming another different type of problem to address in Asian subcontinent. So just moving back to the climate change issues, and we all know pretty much the three major greenhouse gases, methane, nitrous oxide, and carbon dioxide. They're all actually increasing over last several centuries or so, especially that was enhanced due to the industrial revolution onward, use of fertilizers, intense agriculture practices, urban developments actually increased the greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. About 81% of the greenhouse gases produced in the United States, this is 2014, is carbon dioxide. And I think there are a lot of efforts that are going on how to reduce the carbon dioxide emissions. For natural systems, which the one we are concerned, I think, is the methane and nitrous oxide. The methane is really, wetlands are the major source of methane. Up to 11% is produced as compared to the overall greenhouse gas emissions. Nitrous oxide, which usually produce in a transient environments where the wetlands undergo drying or the water table fluctuations, and that's the time you get a lot more nitrous oxide. But most of the nitrous oxide emissions are coming from the agricultural lands. And globally, the patterns are similar, although the methane emissions from the globally is about 16%. That elevation is due to rice paddies. Let's see. Okay. So if you look at the greenhouse gas emissions, nitrous oxide, typically the wetlands are not a source of nitrous oxide. And most of the time, one can assume that because of the intense anaerobic conditions in most of the wetland systems, nitrous oxide actually be consumed by wetland system. In other words, the denitrification, the nitrate conversion to nitrous oxide will go all the way to nitrogen gas. So wetlands are not a very significant source of nitrous oxide, but wetlands are significant source of methane. And of course the carbon dioxide, but carbon dioxide is sequestered through carbon sequestration to the system as well as plant productivity, so the carbon dioxide also considered as a sink in wetland system. The methane which is produced in the soils is actually transported through the roots into the plant, through the plant and emitted to the atmosphere. Similarly, oxygen is transported from plant into the root zones. The reverse is true for the methane. So that's how the 95% of the methane produced in wetlands comes through the plants, not through the water column itself. Because if the methane bubbles through the water column, most of the methane is oxidized right in the water column before it reaches the atmosphere. So the major part of the methane is coming from the plant itself and then emitted to the atmosphere. So that is shown here. The slide, I think, is pretty much shows the methane emissions through the plant and as well as the evolution of the methane from soil to overlying water column. And nitrous oxide can be produced in two pathways. One, during nitrification reaction, nitrous oxide is produced, but this is not very common in wetland system. But if the wetlands are used for intensely for nitrogen removal, especially constructed wetlands, and if you have wet and dry cycles in the system, so you could have the nitrification reaction actually producing some nitrous oxide. But major source of the nitrous oxide is coming from the denitrification. Some of the nitrate is actually incompletely reduced to nitrous oxide because the soils are not highly reduced. So under those conditions, nitrous oxide can be emitted to the atmosphere. But if the soils are very anaerobic and if there's enough energy source, the carbon is present in the system, the nitrate is completely reduced to nitrogen gas, and nitrogen gas is inert. It really doesn't affect, is not part of the greenhouse gases. So like I just mentioned before, the methane is produced under highly reduced conditions, very anaerobic conditions, at the redox potential somewhere between -200 to 300 millivolts, where the nitrous oxide is produced under in a system where the oxygen is consumed, and then in the transient zone you can have the nitrification, denitrification going on, and that pathway can produce nitrous oxide. And hydroperiod has a significant effect on the overall global warming potential of the greenhouse gas. Here we're talking about all the three greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide is presented here as the global warming potential. As you increase the hydroperiod in the systems, the longer the hydroperiod, you reduce the overall greenhouse gas emissions. As compared to the drained systems, you produce a lot more the greenhouse gases, especially carbon dioxide. If you look at the net ecosystem productivity of wetland systems, up to 3% of the carbon is accounted by the methane emissions. As a nice paper published several years ago in Nature by Whiting and Chanton. Just to get an estimate of the methane emissions in the Everglades, if you look at the productive wetland system in Everglades, which is mostly the Taifa, highly nutrient-enriched systems, we're talking about almost 1 metric tons of methane is produced per hectare per year from the water conservation area 2A, and where the unimpacted sites, the pristine sites, you still produce a significant, about half a ton of the methane is produced, but this system is phosphorus limited, so phosphorus is actually controlling the methane emissions in this particular system. You will see the range of values in at the water table, like I mentioned before, has this significant effect on the methane emissions. The lower the water tables, methane will be oxidized and the nitrous oxide can be produced, whereas the carbon dioxide is also produced at higher levels if the water table goes down in the system. So hydro period has a significant effect on the greenhouse gas emissions. And this, of course, the climate change has an effect on the sea level rise. So this is pretty well known now. The sea level rise is real and it's happening. Estimates are in the next, by 2100 or so, you'll see about 1 to 4 feet potentially can be the rise in the sea level rise. And the lowest will be 1 feet, and that's compared to 4 feet. But based on the error margins, I think uncertainty, we talk about even 0.7 to almost 6.6 feet. So it's quite a serious issue. By 2100, I think sea level is on the rise. Hopefully, all the mitigation practices implemented maybe reduce some of this effect over the next few decades. So in Florida and then in Louisiana, we're talking about almost 58,000 kilometers of the land lies below 1.5 meter elevation. So these areas are subjected to sea level rise. So all the restoration programs happening in the Everglades can be potentially affected by the sea level rise in the next few decades. So what happens when the seawater comes into the inundates the freshwater wetlands? Just one example I wanted to show here is the green bars are the seawater wetlands, which is at very high salinity, as compared to yellow one is the freshwater control, and then this salt water was added to the systems. So what happens is when the seawater comes into the freshwater system, one thing will happen. You're getting a lot of sulfate inputs coming into the wetlands freshwater system. What sulfate reduction will do is inhibit the methanogenesis. So it will reduce the methane emissions completely, and then sulfate is the most preferred electron acceptor. It can oxidize the organic matter, but the decomposition of the organic matter could be higher under freshwater wetlands receiving seawater because of sulfate reduction, whereas the freshwater wetlands typically high in organic matter, but they do produce methane, but that methane production can be affected significantly by inputs from the seawater. But that doesn't mean that the seawater will help the carbon sequestration. Actually, seawater coming in can actually reduce the carbon sequestration in wetland systems as a result of the accelerated decomposition through sulfate reduction. So ultimately, I would like to spend a few minutes talking about the water quality issues related to the soils. So when you talk about the water quality issues, maybe you can view this water quality can be affected by several extreme events which may happen in the system. One of them, I put a lot of them on extreme events, contaminant loading. I think I'm going to focus on that one mainly, the fire, the drought, excessive flooding, and also the religion and culture. In Asian subcontinents, especially India, the water is, and the wetlands, rice paddies, all of them part of the culture itself, so that can actually pollute those systems heavily. And the sea level rise, of course, can also have significant effect. So what I want to focus next few minutes is talk about the contaminant loading. The reason I would like to talk a little bit about contaminant loading is the contaminants accumulate in the soil. Anything you add to the wetland systems accumulate, and the wetlands become either sink or source for a given contaminant. So my focus would be mainly, I will talk about the phosphorus issues, because phosphorus is the one actually accumulates in the soil at a much rapid rate than nitrogen or carbon, because the nitrogen and carbon has the gaseous loss pathway. In other words, carbon can be oxidized to carbon dioxide, nitrogen can be oxidized to emit the nitrous oxide or nitrogen gas. So they have a gaseous pathways, where the phosphorus does not have a significant gas pathway. So anytime you add phosphorus, either it accumulates in inorganic pool or in organic pool. And is another example of the Mississippi River Basin here. The impact of the agricultural areas in the Mississippi River Basin is really affecting the nitrate concentrations in the Gulf of Mexico, creating the hypoxia. The nitrate is coming from the in the river basin from the agricultural lands, and the nitrate becomes an electron acceptor. Remember, I mentioned to you before, nitrate is reduced to nitrogen gas, and then during that process, it can create anoxic conditions. And then also the recent oil spills in 2010 it also created significant effect on several water quality issues, and also similar to organic matter, these oil hydrocarbons can also get oxidized, and then that can also create some serious water quality issues. Of course, in the last few years also there's some improvement of the oil degradation in these salt marshes. This is a slide taken in the Barataria Bay in Louisiana. So last few decades where I've worked in Florida, I was involved in a number of ecosystems. What I'd like to focus today is just focus on the Everglades ecosystem, and then just briefly talk about the phosphorus issues. So before I get to that one, I just want to just touch base on one slide, I think, is to show the issue we had in Lake Apopka. Lake Apopka is about 50,000 acres in size, located in central Florida. This particular agricultural land used to be very productive agricultural land used for vegetable production for a number of years, starting in 1930s until 1990s. And the issue here, I think, is these agricultural lands are peatlands, and they absorb a lot of water, and you cannot grow crops once they hold a lot of water, and then the excess drainage water from these areas is pumped into the lake. That was a common practice for the number of years. But in 1990s, the state and federal agencies bought this land and converted them into wetland systems. So they flooded these lands, and once they flooded these lands formerly used for agriculture, something really bad happened. So about 670 birds died as a result of the flooding. One of the causes for that one is some of the pesticides retained in these organic soils were solubilized as a result of flooding. And that's probably one of the reasons why the birds died. But the state agencies have developed the strategies in a way that they inverted this soil and buried all the contaminated soil in subsurface layers and reflooded this area, and they're now restored into wetland systems. So is another example of the dissolved organic matter export. Also, the dissolved organic matter coming from the wetland systems can actually function as the energy source for some of the microbial communities functioning in aquatic systems. And so that can be pollutant in some way, but it's a substrate for the organisms to survive. The phosphorus, this is one of the major issues in South Florida, also is a major issue in many parts of the world. Phosphorus, typically imported into upland systems, accumulates in the soils. And some of it is taken by the plants, but some of it actually leaks out of the system and goes into the wetland system. So the wetlands tend to accumulate the phosphorus over the years, and most of the phosphorus accumulates in the soils. And a portion of that is released and then gets into the lake or stream, whatever the water body you may have. So this transfer of the phosphorus depends on the type of soils you may have in the system. Some soils hold the phosphorus very tightly, and some soils do not hold phosphorus as tightly, such as Florida soils. So the phosphorus, which even if you cut down all the external loads coming into the ecosystem, and some of the phosphorus which already accumulate in the system can pose a serious problem. So I will address that in the next few slides. So
Ramesh, this is Kim. I just want to give you just a reminder on the time. We have about 5 minutes left for presentations because we want to leave 5 minutes for questions.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you. So what we're talking here, I think, is if you have the water column phosphorus concentration in a water body is at this level, the internal memory of the phosphorus, the legacy phosphorus, can maintain the eutrophic conditions even if you cut down all external loads for a long period of time. So the lag time could be several decades. So that's what I wanted to show you. So I'm going to just show you a couple of examples. So here's an example of the Lake Okeechobee north of the lake. The loads going into the Lake Okeechobee for last 40 years or so is about 500 metric tons per year. So this is about starting from 1975 onwards to almost 2013 or 14. So those loads have been very consistent, and then irrespective of how much effort is made in the watershed, including the best management practices, whatever happened, still the loads have not changed. But most of the loads are annually averages here, but most of the loads are actually get to the lake within 2 to 3 months. And the rest of the time you don't have that much load, but the wet season time, that's most of the load goes into the lake. So what I did was our lab really trying to estimate the reactivity of the soil which is stored in the system. We estimated based on our chemical fractionation scheme about 65% of the phosphorus is in reactive pole and 35% is non-reactive pole. So if I use that one and then I estimated the total amount of phosphorus present in the watershed, about 170 metric tons. About 65% of that is reactive, about 110 metric tons, 1,000 metric tons, about 60,000 metric tons. Let's assume for a calculation purpose, not reactive, not biologically available. Okay, and then I use the only two scenarios here. 10% is reactive. Out of this reactive pool, I only use 10%, which comes out of the system. And then another case, I said only 25% will come from the system. So I know the loading road going to the lake is about 500 metric tons. So this 11,000 metric tons, it will take 22 years. The lag time we're talking about, if you really very conservatively estimate this, the discharge, as compared if you assume 25%, we're talking 56 years. But if I assume all this is coming, eventually leaks out, then we're talking about over 100, 150, 200 years. So that is the effort thing I'm talking about is the legacy phosphorus. So even if you cut down the external loads, I think into the lake from other sources, the internal legacy phosphorus can maintain the eutrophic conditions at 500 metric tons per year for this many years. Once you do that one, you got a similar situation. There's sediments in the lake itself function as a source. So that will last anywhere from 12 to 31 years, assuming the same scenarios. And the same story goes in the Everglades agricultural area. So I'm going to move up so fast, I think, to stay in time. So here you're talking about the Everglades agricultural area, sugarcane fields. They produce about 160 metric tons. And if that water is not intercepted, so that will last for 47 to 118 years. So just focus on these lag times, which is very, very important in addressing the management strategies. So the message I want to give you here, I think, is both the biotic and abiotic process both regulate phosphorus flux from soil to sediment. That's very important. And then we need to address the legacy phosphorus issues because that can actually keep the wetlands or aquatic system you're trying to restore under eutrophic conditions for a long period of time. And so how do you address this one? We need some drastic remedial measures. The BMPs alone will not do it. So you need some wetlands, constructed wetland systems, chemical amendments, whatever you want to use it, so to reduce the lag time. So that may actually help to reduce the overall load to the wetlands. So finally, I want to just leave you this one message I want you to think about is that as we all walk through the wetland systems, we all admire beautiful plants, flowers, birds, and this is all we talk about all the time, flowing water, but rarely think about the living soil we are standing on it. So under our feet, which actually doing all the dirty work for everybody, but I think we don't think about it. But I think the mud in the soil is the long-term integrators of the storage of elements, like I mentioned before, and they can serve both as a sink or source of nutrients. And the chemical and biological processes essentially control the majority of the functions. What happens in the wetland system, all the ecosystem services are controlled by these chemical biological processes happening in the soil. So these are similar to the brain orchestrating many factors of the human body. So think about it in that sense. And also the wetlands are known to be sink or source for greenhouse gases depending on the conditions. And finally, I would like to leave the message of the legacy nutrients. It's very important to address legacy nutrients, especially when we spend billions of dollars in reducing the external loads. We should think about the legacy nutrients which are already there and their effect, and then trying to mitigate or develop strategies to reduce the effect of this legacy phosphorus. With that, I'd like to acknowledge the work for the last 4 decades, number of agencies, especially during my tenure at Florida, which is in my 37th year now. Several agencies funded programs, all of them are listed here, and also several colleagues, not only in my university, St. John's Waterman District. I worked with them since the 80s, South Florida Waterman District, and also my colleagues, my former home, Louisiana State University. With that, I'll be happy to take any questions you may have. And if you want to look at some of our work, the publications, they're all available at this website. Thank you, Kim. Thank you. I would like to thank the Society of Wetland Scientists for giving me this opportunity to make this presentation.
Thank you so much, Ramesh. I really appreciate that you took your time out to do this. And we have a few minutes left, and I have one question from an audience member. And the question is, due to the phosphorus peak, do we have to expect a big danger to wetlands conservation by eventual wetlands mining? So I think, you know, maybe worried about mining the wetlands to get the phosphorus that's in them as to be used as a fertilizer or something else.
You know, I think that's an excellent question. It depends on the societal value of the wetlands. So societal value meaning that I asked this question in my class of wetland biogeochemistry. What if I take the Everglades ecosystem, put it in India or China, for example? Where the food security is a major issue, I would imagine that most of the Everglades would have been rice paddies by now. So I think it depends on the societal value, but I don't think you will have that much accumulation of phosphorus in wetland systems to mine that phosphorus. In certain areas of the world, Kim, wetlands actually mined because especially wetlands receiving a lot of sediment loads, the silt deposits are actually taken out and then used as a nutrient source in rice paddies, other cropping systems, so it happens already. Shallow water bodies accumulate a lot of silt, and they take that silt and then deposit in the agricultural fields. So I think I'm not worried about too much about the mining of phosphorus, because I don't think we're going to accumulate that much phosphorus really to make an effort to mine. But out of desperation, maybe in some areas of the world they may do that one, but not for phosphorus, but probably for the overall nutrient source.
So I was actually thinking about something while you were talking about methane, and you said that when there's vegetation there, that the methane actually cycles through the vegetation and not through the water column. Yeah. And I wondered if that would encourage people to have, you know, maybe these deeper, more submerged aquatic vegetation, or maybe open pond areas as opposed to having vegetated wetlands and marshes. Do you think that they would, folks would, you know, manage towards that direction for methane?
You know, right now, about almost 20% of the methane emissions are coming from wetland systems globally. So it's a very significant source of methane, and wherever it's possible, maybe eventually one thing we should start thinking about is there any way, especially when you're trying to restore wetlands, can we restore the wetlands not only for a habitat improvement or the water quality improvement, but also we should probably start thinking about how we can actually reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, especially methane. Is there any way? The only way you can reduce the methane emissions is 2 ways. One, you had to change the hydro period sometimes, so that would help to some extent, and also the vegetation types may help. But I think the benefits wetlands provide, in my opinion, is far greater than the amount of methane coming out. So even if they produce methane at the same level, if we can control the other greenhouse gas emissions in a different way, so the wetlands do provide a very valuable service. I don't think, I hope the agencies won't think about draining the wetlands, altering the wetlands, and I'm hoping that they're going to keep it as it is. Just deal with it to reduce the emissions from other sources, other locations. The animal waste operations like animal industries, major source of methane, that can be managed there. Rice paddies, so that can be managed. Rice paddy is already working on converting the management practices to reduce the methane emissions, nitrous oxide emissions in rice paddies. So there's other ways you can do it. Natural wetlands, I'm hoping they're going to leave them as it is. Otherwise, they're going to do a lot more damage than the benefit they derive.
Well, thank you for that. I think we're out of time for questions. There was a couple more, and I can send those to you offline. One was about your very quick example about Lake Apopka, and did they determine what the chemical was that killed the birds, and also folks wanting to share some of those slides with their students. And so maybe we can talk about that offline. Those people who asked those questions have my email address and your email address in the presentation, I believe, and they can certainly go to your website. If you would, Ramesh, go to the next slide, and I want to just kind of warn people about what's coming up. If you all would mark your calendars for our next webinar in January with Dr. Li-Feng Li from the World Wildlife Fund, and that'll be January 17th. You can register on the upcoming webinars page. And I want to thank all of our SWS members and our non-member guests again for joining us. And if you enjoyed today's webinar, you might be encouraged to become a member. So make sure that you visit our webpage to find out about the membership benefits. And then finally, at the last slide, I want to let everyone know that today, registration for the 2017 SWS annual meeting in Puerto Rico has just opened. So you can either register for the conference, submit an abstract to present, you can nominate a colleague for an SWS award, or you can apply for a student travel or research grant. So go to the annual meeting website that you see on that slide. And also, lastly, we're proud to announce the name of the official mascot for the meeting, and I guess that's off the screen now, is Humberto. So thank you for everyone that participated in that contest. Make sure you look for Humberto at the bottom of all the annual meeting emails, or follow him on Twitter at Humberto the Frog. And we'll share interesting facts about Puerto Rico every time you see him. So again, I want to thank you, Ramesh, for taking your time out today to do this legacy webinar. And hopefully we won't think about legacy phosphorus. We think about your legacy webinar. So thank you, everyone, for attending.